Do you remember the suppers tucked deep in the Appalachian mountains? The ones passed quietly from kitchen to kitchen, never written down. They weren't fancy, but they filled bellies, stretched gardens, and carried families through hard times. What happened to those secret meals that once defined mountain life in the 1950s? Squirrel Stew. Now here's a supper that makes some folks lean in with curiosity. Squirrel Stew. Back in the 1950s mountains, if a boy had good aim with a .22 or a slingshot, supper was practically guaranteed. Squirrels were everywhere in the hollers, and a couple of them could turn into a hearty pot of stew when money was tight. Mama would clean and cut the meat, simmer it low with onions, carrots, and potatoes, sometimes tossing in a handful of home-canned tomatoes for good measure. The flavor? A little richer than chicken, with a wild edge that reminded you it came straight from the woods. For mountain families, this wasn't exotic or strange. It was just another way to put meat on the table when the store was miles away and money was scarce. Today, many people would never dream of eating squirrel, but back then, it was considered a clean, plentiful protein. And while it may raise eyebrows now, those who grew up on squirrel stew will tell you it was one of the most comforting suppers you could ladle into a bowl. Poke salad with cornbread. Now here's one of those suppers that really separates the mountain folks from everyone else. Poke salad. If you're not from Appalachia, you probably know pokeweed as that tall plant with dark purple berries, and you've likely heard it's poisonous. And you'd be right if you didn't know what you were doing. But mountain mamas had the secret. Gather the tender young leaves in spring, boil them in 2 or 3 changes of water to cook out the toxins, then fry them up in bacon grease until they were tender and smoky. Served alongside a wedge of hot cornbread, poke salad was a delicacy that tasted like the mountains waking up after winter. Outsiders would never dream of touching it, but locals swore by its flavor and even believed it had medicinal powers. Kids grumbled at the bitter bite, but grown-ups cleaned their plates, proud of a dish that came straight from the hillside. Today, most folks wouldn't dare pick pokeweed, much less serve it for supper, which is why it remains one of Appalachia's best-kept secrets. Fried corn with salt pork. Nothing said summer like fried corn. Appalachian families cut kernels straight off the cob, then milked the cob with the back of a knife to catch every drop of starchy sweetness. Tossed into a cast-iron skillet with sizzling salt pork, the corn turned golden, smoky, and slightly sticky. Nothing like the creamed corn from a can. The popping and crackling from that skillet was enough to call the children in from the yard. Served hot beside a pan of cornbread or with sliced tomatoes from the garden. Fried corn was humble, but it was a feast to anyone who'd been working in the fields all day. Leather britches. If you ever stepped onto a mountain porch in late summer, you might have seen strings of green beans dangling in the sun like laundry on the line. These weren't decorations. They were leather britches, one of Appalachia's secret ways of preserving food for the winter. Families would snap fresh beans, thread them with a needle, and hang them to dry until they shriveled and turned leathery, hence the name. Come cold weather, Mama would pull down a bundle, simmer them in a pot until they plumped back up, and season them with onions, salt, and maybe a spoonful of bacon grease if she had it to spare. The beans had a smoky, chewy taste, unlike anything you'd find in a grocery store, earthy and hearty enough to make a meal all on their own. Today, very few people even know what leather britches are, let alone how to make them. But for 50s, mountain women, they were a secret weapon for keeping supper on the table all year round. Ramps and fried taters. When spring broke through the chill of winter, mountain families knew it was ramp season. These wild onions were foraged on hillsides and carried home in baskets, their pungent smell trailing behind the gatherers. Fried up with sliced potatoes in a cast-iron skillet, ramps turned an ordinary supper into something that tasted like the first breath of spring. with a wedge of cornbread and maybe a jar of home-canned beans. Ramps and fried taters were a celebration of the mountains waking up again. To this day, ramp festivals dot Appalachian towns, but back in the 50s, this was simply how Mama cooked when the hills offered up their gifts. It was a reminder that the land always provided. Cabbage and onions. Cabbage was one of those crops that kept forever in the cool of a mountain cellar, and it often found its way into the supper pot. A big head of cabbage, sliced thick with onions, could be fried down in a cast-iron skillet until the edges caramelized and the kitchen filled with that sweet, earthy smell. Some families added a few diced potatoes for extra bulk, while others poured in a splash of vinegar to give it tang. Nowadays, we think of cabbage as something for coleslaw or diets, but back in the 50s mountains, a skillet of fried cabbage and onions was supper. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush was one of the thriftiest suppers in Appalachia. Mama would cook plain cornmeal in water or milk until it thickened into a dense porridge. Once cooled, she'd slice it into slabs and fry them in bacon grease or butter until the edges crisped golden brown. Topped with sorghum molasses for a sweet bite or a drizzle of milk for comfort, it became both supper and dessert rolled into one. Poor families leaned on mush when money ran out before payday, and it carried folks through lean times without shame. For mountain kids, fried mush was a treat. They didn't know it was poor folks' food. Cornmeal mush may sound plain to us now, but to families in the 50s, it was proof that even the simplest grain could be turned into something that felt special. Cornmeal-Crusted Catfish. When the creeks and rivers ran high, mountain families cast their lines for supper. Catfish was a favorite catch, rolled in seasoned cornmeal and fried until the crust crackled between your teeth, and it didn't take more than 1 or 2 fish to feed a whole family. Some families even ate bony fish like suckers, which most outsiders turned their noses up at, but Appalachian folks knew how to cook them down into something edible. A platter of fried catfish with a side of hush puppies or cornbread was a supper worth bragging about. While fish fries today feel like special events, in the mountains of the 50s, it was just another way of turning what the land, or in this case, the water, provided into a feast. Fried apples and biscuits. Not every supper was savory. Sometimes, when meat was scarce and the pantry was running low, Mama turned to the orchard. Sliced apples, fried in butter or lard with a sprinkle of sugar and cinnamon, made the house smell like heaven itself. Served with hot biscuits straight from the oven, fried apples filled the belly and gave everyone the feeling of having had something sweet and indulgent. And Mama could breathe easy, knowing she'd stretched another day without spending a dime at the store. Fried apples weren't just dessert. They were supper in their own right, and one that has quietly slipped out of most kitchens today. Beans and greens with cornbread dumplings. When the garden gave both beans and greens, mountain women knew how to make a meal of them. Pinto beans, or white beans, simmered down with a mess of collard or turnip greens, made a hearty, earthy stew. To stretch it further, Mama would drop spoonfuls of cornbread batter right into the pot, where they puffed into tender dumplings. The broth soaked into the dumplings, turning them into little pockets of comfort that made you forget there wasn't any meat on the table. For Appalachian families, this was resourcefulness at its best. A pot of beans, some foraged greens, and a handful of cornmeal turned into a supper that stuck with you through long days in the field. Johnnycakes with sorghum. Before store-bought bread became a regular sight in Appalachian kitchens, Johnnycakes were the go-to. Made with just cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, these flat griddle cakes were crisp on the edges and tender in the middle. Mountain mamas fried them right on a cast-iron skillet, then drizzled them with sorghum molasses or honey for a touch of sweetness. Paired with a cup of milk or a side of fried apples, They made a supper that was simple but deeply satisfying. The best part was their versatility. You could eat them plain, pile beans on top, or treat them like dessert. For families scraping by in the 1950s, Johnnycakes weren't just food. They were a lifeline. Today they've been nearly replaced by pancakes and cornbread, but nothing matches that smoky skillet taste of Johnnycakes hot off the griddle. Dandelion greens with vinegar. Springtime in the mountains didn't just bring ramps. It brought fields full of dandelions, and mountain women saw supper where others saw weeds. They'd gather the young, tender leaves before the flowers bloomed, boil them once to soften the bite, then fry them up with bacon grease or just a splash of oil. A dash of vinegar gave the dish a sharp tang that cut right through the bitterness. Served with cornbread, dandelion greens were cheap, plentiful, and packed with vitamins long before superfoods became a buzzword. Mamas swore by them, calling them a spring tonic to clean out the blood. These days, most people spend money trying to kill dandelions in their yards, but in the 50s, Appalachian kitchen, they were dinner on the table. Fish head soup. Here's a supper that might make modern folks squirm. Fish head soup. In the mountains, nothing went to waste, especially not the parts others threw away. Heads, bones, and scraps from a good catch went into the pot with onions, potatoes, and garden herbs. Simmered low, the broth turned rich and savory, flavored by every bit of the fish. Families swore it put hair on your chest, though kids weren't always thrilled to see a fish eye floating in their bowl. Today, most people wouldn't dream of it, but back then, fish head soup was a reminder that supper could be pulled together, even from what others tossed aside. Sweet potato biscuits. When the garden gave sweet potatoes, Appalachian mamas worked them into everything, even biscuits. Mashed into the dough, the potatoes made the biscuits tender, slightly sweet, and the color of autumn leaves. Served with butter and sorghum, they could be a full supper when meat wasn't around. Sometimes families sliced leftover biscuits and ate them the next morning with fried eggs, but nothing beat them hot out of the oven. Sweet potato biscuits were proof that even a humble root could be turned into something that tasted special. While today we think of them as a holiday novelty, in the mountains, they were just another way Mama stretched her pantry and filled bellies without complaint. Pickled beans and corn. Pickling wasn't just for cucumbers in Appalachia. Beans and corn often found their way into brine jars too. Strung green beans and kernels of sweet corn were layered together and left to ferment in stone crocks, producing a tangy, crunchy side dish that sometimes became the main event. On nights when meat was scarce, a bowl of pickled beans and corn with a hunk of cornbread was all a family needed. It had a sharp bite that woke up the taste buds, and mountain folks believed it kept them healthy through the long winters. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone under 60 who remembers eating it. But in the 50s, it was a kitchen secret Mama kept tucked away in her cellar, ready to turn a plain supper into something memorable. Hominy with fried onions. Hominy was one of those Appalachian foods that took time and patience. Dried corn kernels were soaked in lye water until they swelled and softened, the husks slipping free. It wasn't glamorous work, but it transformed ordinary corn into something hearty that kept families full. In the 1950s, mountain women often fried hominy with onions in a heavy skillet, giving it a nutty, savory flavor that stuck to your ribs after a long day. But for mountain kitchens, hominy was a clever way of turning one staple into a meal that could last through winter. Skillet cabbage and potatoes. Cabbage and potatoes were the kind of ingredients that never ran out in a mountain cellar, and they often ended up together in the skillet. Sliced cabbage and diced potatoes sizzled with onions until the whole kitchen filled with the smell of something simple but satisfying. Some cooks added a splash of vinegar for tang, others just relied on salt and pepper. It was plain, yes, but dependable. The kind of supper that carried families through when there wasn't much else in the pantry. On cold nights, a steaming plate of skillet cabbage and potatoes with a hunk of cornbread felt like enough to keep the world at bay. Today, it's nearly vanished from dinner tables. But for Appalachian families in the 50s, it was one of those quiet meals that did the job without fanfare. Egg and onion gravy. Egg and onion gravy was a mountain trick for stretching a handful of eggs into supper. Onions were browned until sweet, then stirred into a skillet with eggs, flour, and milk until the mixture thickened into a golden, velvety gravy. Ladled over biscuits or mashed potatoes, it turned something humble into a meal that filled everyone at the table. Kids might not have realized there wasn't any meat involved. They only knew it was warm, savory, and comforting. For families in the hollers, egg gravy was proof that creativity in the kitchen mattered more than money in the wallet. It's rarely seen today, but back then it was a reliable supper when options were few. Rabbit stew. Up in the mountains of Appalachia during the 1950s, rabbit was considered chicken of the hollow. Families raised them in hutches or snared them in the woods, and the meat was lean, tender, and surprisingly versatile. Stewed slowly with onions, carrots, and potatoes, rabbit turned into a dish that filled the cabin with rich, savory aromas. Some folks fried it like chicken, but stew made the most of every scrap. Outsiders might not be up for it, but for mountain families, rabbit stew was ordinary. Just another way to keep supper on the table when store-bought meat wasn't an option. Today it feels like a rarity, but back then it was as common as fried chicken is now. Chow-Chow over pinto beans. Every Appalachian pantry had jars of Chow-Chow lined up by late summer, a tangy relish made of cabbage, peppers, green tomatoes, and onions. In winter, it came out to brighten otherwise plain suppers. A spoonful of Chow-Chow over a steaming bowl of pinto beans transformed the ordinary into something lively and colorful. Each family had its own recipe, handed down and fiercely defended. Some sweet, some fiery hot. In the 1950s mountains, Chow-Chow wasn't just a condiment. It was a way of making sure the hard work of canning paid off all year long. These days, it's rarely found outside of farmers' markets, but for Appalachian kitchens, Chow-Chow was the secret that kept beans from ever feeling dull. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches might not sound like supper today, but in the Appalachian Mountains back in the day, they often stood in for a full meal. A spoonful of peanut butter was mixed with thick cane syrup or molasses until it turned glossy and sweet, then spread onto homemade bread or leftover biscuits. It was the kind of meal that showed up when the pantry looked empty, but no one had time to complain. Families kept cane syrup in their kitchens because it was cheaper than sugar, and when combined with peanut butter, it made a sandwich that could keep a person going through the evening. It wasn't served with ceremony, just set on a plate and eaten without fuss, but it carried memories of hard times and resourcefulness. Ask folks who grew up in the mountains, and many will still remember the taste of those gooey sandwiches, the way the syrup soaked into the bread, and how a humble pairing managed to stand in as supper when little else was left. Succotash with cornbread. Succotash in the mountains wasn't the neat, colorful side dish you see in cookbooks today. It was a hearty skillet of corn and beans, usually lima or pole beans, cooked down together until the flavors melted into one another. In some kitchens, a splash of cream was added. In others, it stayed plain and savory. Cornbread nearly always showed up alongside, crumbled into the bowl to soak up the juices. It was practical food, pulled from the garden and made to stretch through the week. Families didn't think of it as special, but it was one of those suppers that quietly carried households from one season to the next. Today, it's rare to see succotash made from scratch, but in the 50s, Appalachians, it was a familiar and reliable meal. Pickled beets and eggs. Colorful food was a rarity in Appalachian kitchens, but jars of pickled beets and eggs stood out on the pantry shelf like stained glass. Beets were cooked, sliced, and brined with vinegar and spices, then joined by boiled eggs, which took on a deep purple hue after a few days in the jar. By the time they reached the table, the eggs had a tangy bite and a jewel-like color that made them memorable. Served with biscuits or alongside beans, they were a supper that felt both thrifty and celebratory. Families didn't waste a thing. The leftover brine was sometimes poured over cabbage or cucumbers to start the process all over again. It was the kind of food that made visitors raise an eyebrow, but left locals nodding with recognition. Sorghum syrup and biscuits. When the sorghum mill ran in autumn, families lined up to fill jars with the thick amber syrup that would last all winter. In many homes, supper was nothing more than hot biscuits and a drizzle of sorghum, sticky and sweet. It wasn't considered a treat. It was a staple, something children grew up on and adults leaned on when meat was scarce. The flavor was earthy and unmistakable, different from the store-bought syrups that later took its place. A plate of sorghum and biscuits might not look like much, but in the Appalachian mountains, it carried the taste of the harvest and the promise of a full belly without spending a dime at the store. Irish potato soup. Potatoes were dependable in the mountain garden, and they often ended up as the base for a simple soup. Sliced thin or diced, they simmered in water with onions and just enough milk to give the broth a little body. Some cooks added a pat of butter if they had it. Others left it plain. It was the kind of meal that warmed the bones on a cold night without emptying the pantry. Families gathered around bowls of potato soup not because it was fancy, but because it was what was available. And it kept everyone satisfied. It was a staple that showed up again and again. Wild greens and vinegar. Not every supper came from the garden rows. Mountain women gathered wild greens from the hillsides, lamb's quarters, dock, and mustard, and cooked them down into a tangy, savory dish. A splash of vinegar was added right at the end, giving the greens a sharp edge that cut through their earthy flavor. Paired with cornbread, this could be an entire meal, one that tasted like the land itself. For families who knew which plants were safe to eat, wild greens meant food security without spending a penny. Outsiders often dismissed them as weeds, but for Appalachian households, they were trusted companions at the supper table. In the 1950s, they weren't considered unusual. They were just part of mountain living. The Appalachian Mountains of the 1950s held secrets in every kitchen, suppers that made the most of what the land, garden, and cellar could offer. Some of these meals sound unusual today, even unthinkable, while others feel like they've simply been left behind in favor of convenience. But for the families who lived them, they weren't curiosities. They were supper, plain and simple. Remembering these dishes is more than nostalgia. It's a glimpse into the resourcefulness and resilience of mountain women who knew how to keep food on the table no matter what.